In this video, I am going to show you how to insert, update, delete, and read process of SQL Server database using C# ASP.NET. First, let's connect the SQL Server database. So click on the Solution Explorer, then double click on web.config file, and in the configuration tag, add another tag, that is connection string, and in the connection string add another tag, that is add, then name, then data underscore connection. This is my connection name. After this, connection string. Now let's click on view, then click on the server explorer, right click on the data connection, then click on add connection. If you are using free version, that is SQL Express, then simply type /SQL Express, and in the authentication, Windows authentication, then select the database and click on test connection. I am using the full version, so I will click on the drop down and select the SQL Server name, and in the authentication, SQL Server authentication, and in the username I will type the username and the password of my SQL Server. After this, I will select the database. My database is hospital, so click on test connection, then click on OK, then click on OK. Now right click on the data connection, then click on properties, then click on the connection string, Ctrl A, Ctrl C, and paste it over this connection string. And we have to change only the password with the password of my SQL Server, that is admin@123, and save it. I am writing this connection string over this web.config file because if any changes in the password of my SQL Server or the IP address of my computer, then we will change only in this web.config file, and we will not change the connection string on every web page or on every button or any event click. If it is changed here, it will be effect on all web form. So I am writing this connection string over this web.config file. Now let's demonstrate how to insert data into SQL Server database using C# ASP.NET. I have already designed the web form. I achieved this design by simply clicking on the toolbar and selecting a label and dropping onto the web form. In the same way, simply clicking on the toolbar and selecting a text box and dropping onto the web form. If you want to change this label text, then simply select the label and type F4 and change the text to ID. It will change the text of this label to ID. I change the button text. If you want to change the text of this button, then simply select the button and type F4 and change this text to clear or any name which you want to change. Then it will change the button name. Now let's delete all the label which I have just inserted and text box. I have changed the ID of this text box, that is TB, and that is the text box of this ID with the TB underscore ID. I have changed the ID of this text box with TB underscore ID. In the same way, name text box as TB underscore name. In the same way, address text box as TB underscore address. And in the search, I have changed TB underscore ID into search. I have changed this ID of this text box. In this web form, I have used 4 tools. That is, one is button, second is label, third is text box, and the last one is the grid view on this web form. Double click on the save button. In this button click event, I am going to write the code for inserting data into the SQL Server. Before writing the code, let's first add some namespaces. So scroll on the top and type using system dot data. After this, using system dot data dot SQL client or SQL client. After this, using system dot configuration. All these tags are used for connecting SQL Server database. Double click the Save button again. In this, I am going to paste the code for inserting data into the SQL Server. The first line of code is for connecting SQL Server. My SQL connection is known as con, and in this code I am going to change only this data connection name or the connection SQL Server connection name. This can be derived from the web.config file. So double click on the web.config file and copy this connection string name and paste it over here. So simply paste the connection string name. You can give any name of your choice. I am given here data underscore connection. The first line of code is for connecting SQL Server database, and my SQL connection is con. The second line is for inserting data into the SQL Server. I have given my SQL command as cmd. First, let's see my table. My table is registration, and it has three fields: ID, name, and address. So let's see the second line. My SQL command is cmd, and its command is insert into registration, means the table name, that is insert into registration, and its ID, name, and address is the field of this table, and its value will be taken from tbid, tbname, and tbaddress, and its connection string name is con. This tbid, tbname is the ID of this text box. So select text box and type F4. This is the ID of this. tb underscore ID is the ID of the text box. tb name is the ID of this text box, and tb address is the ID of this text box. So the value will be taken from this tbid, tb name, and tb address. These are the text box given on the web form. You can copy this code. I will pause a little bit and you can copy this code. This is my code. You can copy it by pushing a little bit. Now I have used here try and catch. I am using this try and catch so that if anything wrong happen during the connection or connecting the database and inserting the database, then the system will not crash or the web page will not be crashed. So I am using here try and catch. In the try and catch, I have given here connection con.open, means SQL connection will be open, and cmd means the command of SQL command will be executed, and if it is successful, then it will display save successful on the lb underscore text label. It will display save successful on this lb underscore display. This is the ID of this label. That is lb underscore display is the ID of this label. So if it is successful, lb underscore display dot text, in that text it will display save successful, and the connection, that is connection of SQL Server, will be closed. Now let's run the project and see whether the inserting of data in the SQL Server is successful or not. So type 1 ID 1 and name James, and in the address New York, and click on save button. So the insertion of data in the SQL Server is successful. Now let's learn how to display this data in the grid view. In order to display data in the grid view, double click on the save button. After this, scroll up and let's declare a function private void grid view display. I am declaring a function here, and the function name is GridView underscore display. I am writing here a function here so that we don't need to type the code again. Now I will paste the code for displaying data in the grid view. This is the code for displaying data in the grid view. First line is for connecting SQL Server, and in the third line I am selecting ID, name and address from the table registration, and it will display data in the grid view 1. So you can copy this code, and this code is for displaying data in the grid view. So grid view 1 is the name of this ID of this grid view. So this is the ID of this grid view, that is tb underscore that is grid view 1. So grid view 1 is the ID of this grid view. So the grid view 1 is the ID of this grid view. This is the code for displaying data in the grid view. I am declaring here a function so that we don't need to type this code again and again. We can simply call this function, and it will display the data in the grid view. Now let's call the function. So double click on the save button and type here grid view display. This is the function for displaying data in the grid view. Instead of writing this code, that is instead of writing whole this code, we will simply write this function name, and we will simply write the function name, and it will display data in the grid view. Instead of writing full code, we will type only the function name. This code is for displaying data in the grid view. This is the function name of displaying data in the grid view. That is when data is inserted, and it will display data in the grid view. This function will display data in the grid view. And we have to write one function on the page load. Page load means whenever the web page load, it will load the data in the grid view. So I will call the function here again, that is grid view display. In the page load, I will write this function, that is grid view display. This will whenever the web page load, it will load the data in the grid view. Now let's run the project and see whether the function is operating or not. So let's run the project, and type the ID here. In the ID, type 2. So in the page load, the data which was present in the table was loaded in this grid view. Now type a name, that is Rahul, and address India, and click on save. So in the save button, I have already declared the function, that is grid view display. So the data is displayed in the grid view, and in the page load also data is displayed on the grid view. So the function of displaying data in the grid view, that is grid view display, is functioning. Now let's write the code for updating SQL Server database. So double click on the update button, and I will paste the code for updating SQL Server database. This is the code for updating SQL Server database. In the first line, I am connecting the SQL Server database. In the second line, I am declaring a string, that is str, and nulling the string, that is emptying the stack, that is nulling all the data in the string. And in the try and case, I am open the SQL connection, and str means the string, and I have written the code for updating SQL code for updating the SQL Server database. So update register means the table name, set name means the ID of this name, and its value will be taken from the TB name, and address will be taken from the TB address, where ID equal to TB underscore ID, where the ID will be taken from the ID, means it will update the name address where ID is equal to the ID of the TB ID, and SQL command will be executed, and if it is successful, update successful will display on the lb underscore display dot text, and I am calling the function GridView underscore display. This is the function for displaying data on the grid view. This is the code for updating SQL Server database. Now let's run the project and see whether it is successful or not. Now type in the ID, I will type 1 and it will type James 2, and address I will type New York 2 and click on. So in the ID 1 the name is James and the address is New York, so click on update. So the name is changed with 2 James 2 and the address is changed to New York 2. So the name and address will be changed where the ID is 1. Now let's learn the code for deleting SQL Server database. So double click on the delete button. I will paste the code for deleting SQL Server database. So the first line is for connecting SQL Server, and I am declaring a string that is string and nulling the string. And in the try case, connection will be open and the SQL query is written here. Delete registration means the name of this table, that is registration where ID equal to TBID. So it will delete the table data where ID is equal to TBID. So it will delete data where the data is, where the row has the ID with this text box. So it will delete the data of the table registration where ID equal to, where the ID will be same as the TB underscore ID. The SQL command will execute it, and if it is successful, it will display delete successful on the LB underscore display, and the connection will be closed. And GridView display, I am calling the function for displaying data on the GridView. Now let's run the project. Now let's try to delete this second row, that is ID is 1. So simply type ID 1 and click on the delete button. So the second row is deleted. So the row of the data is deleted where ID is 1. Now let's write the code for searching data in the SQL Server. So double click on the search button. I will paste the code for searching data in the SQL Server. So in the first line I am connecting the SQL Server. This is the code for searching data in the SQL Server. In the first line I am connecting SQL Server data, connect the SQL Server database, and I am declaring a string, and this string is used for SQL query. I am nulling all the string, and connection open means connection of SQL Server will open, and in the SQL query will be select ID name and address, that is the field of the table, that is ID name and address. I will select ID name and address from table registration where ID is equal to TB underscore ID search, that is the ID of this text box, that is the ID of this text box is TB underscore ID underscore search. So this is the, so I will select data ID name and address, that is field of ID name and address from table registration where ID is actually matched with the TB underscore ID underscore search dot text. So it will search the ID, search the row of the data of the table where ID is actually matched with this ID underscore TB underscore ID underscore search dot text. Now the SQL command will be executed, and I am declaring another SQL data reader, that is reader will be execute cmd command. This reader will execute this cmd command, and if it is successful, then the data, that is data of this first row, data of name, ID name and address will be read, and it will be displayed on the TB underscore ID, TB name and TB address. That is that if the read is successful, then the data will be displayed on this text box. So read is successful, the TB ID will be given read. Array will be start from 0. So the 0 I am declaring here 0 means first is 0, second is 1, second is 2. So ID will be taken 0, name will be 1, and address there is 2 dot to string. So the data read will be converted into string. If it is not, if the reading of data is false, then it will display id does not exist, means there is no data in where id is given in this id box. Now let's run the project and see whether it is successful or not. Now type the id here 2 and click on search button, so data is displayed on this text box.